Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of how to talk policy and influence people. And today I am joined by Rebecca Lewis-Pankratz, who is in Kansas in the US. So I'm really excited. Hi, Rebecca.
Hello, Jane. So happy to be here with you.
Thank you I think it's pretty early there still, is it?
It's noon. So
Okay,
yeah,
because
you
sent me an email once very early, so I wasn't quite sure at what ungodly hour I had resurrected you. But can you tell me a bit about yourself, Rebecca, please, and your background and that type of thing?
Yeah, Jane. So I work for an educational service center. And what that means is that we have school districts that are members and we do professional development for them. But we're also entrepreneurial, which means that we don't get federal or state funding. So we're pretty hungry.
Okay.
But the organization that I work for is really invested in transformation. What is it going to take to transform schools? And then, what does that mean for the communities? And what does it mean for the families? So really understanding that this is kind of we're all in this together, and we'll get farther together kind of process. So what I do is I am a part of the Essdack Resilience team. And so we really are helping our districts and communities understand the science of trauma and the neuroscience, and really how to increase learning through relationships. But then they also let me build poverty projects.
Okay.
So I have a huge kind of initiative, I guess, for lack of a better word, where we go into communities and kind of rally champions. And in about a year, we get poverty projects off the ground. The parents that we recruit to be a part of this process come to us for 2 to 5 years to really build a path out of poverty permanently. And part of that process is also recruiting middle-class people to be in friendship with these families. So it really is still all about relationships.
Yeah.
And transforming stories, generations, people through the power of connection.
Fantastic. Well, I think it was Sissy White who mentioned to me recently, you really need to talk to Rebecca, because Rebecca does amazing work in communities. So that's really interesting. And I might come back to that in a moment, that particular strand of the work. But when and how did you kind of get interested in trauma and adversity, or where did you discover the science? Has it been, have you known about it for a long time, or has it been a more recent discovery for you?
Yeah, Jane, thanks for that question, because I think most people who find this work, the science is kind of mind-bending. And I had gone through the poverty project in my community in 2011, and then got hired to work there in 2012. So, and I was in college to be a teacher. So I had this kind of, I had what's called birth to 5 brain science.
Okay.
Teaching.
Yeah.
Right. And that science taught us that, your brain architecture was built and it was fixed by age 5. And like 0 to 5 for me was like really intense. Lots of stuff happened. And then, in prior to 2011, I had just spent a lifetime in a cycle of domestic abuse, violence, poverty, addiction. Right. So, and I finished off my long-term stint in addiction with severe alcoholism. And so between the birth to 5 brain science and this narrative in America that you only have so many brain cells, and if you do drugs or drink, like,
Okay.
so between these two things, Jane, it wasn't looking good for me, right? And as I started to walk out of poverty in this relationship-based poverty project, right? All these middle-class women around me supporting me, like I could feel something happening up here in my brain. Like I could feel it.
Wow.
And I started doing consulting, right? And I started doing consulting, and I was telling teachers, I was like, I'm telling you, relationships change brains. And I'm like, I'm not a researcher. I'm not ever going to be able to prove that. But I know that, you know, I was beginning to be able to see forward. I was becoming less reactive, becoming more trusting of people that I didn't know, right? Like I was able to start walking into rooms with 30 people that I did not know and finding a seat at the table and feeling a sense of belonging. And what was fascinating was that I was watching that same thing happen to the families that I was working with, mostly from generational poverty. So I became really fascinated with the brain on poverty. And I was reading studies and looking at brain scans, and I realized people were actually researching this. And because of that fascination, Jane, I accidentally stepped into the brain on adversity, the science of trauma, and then found the ACE study. And, you know, what I help people understand is that, you know, I asked people, you know, I was looking at two sets of brain scans, the brain on poverty and the brain on adversity, trauma. And what did I see? Right? It was the same picture, because the brain doesn't know if it's war, abuse, famine, like it just wires itself for protection, right? Then, because of that kind of accidental introduction.
Sorry, Rebecca.
You're fine. Hey, how are you?
You can say a quick hello. I'm doing an interview.
Hi.
Sorry, Rebecca.
You're
you go again. Apologies.
Those little people are the only thing holding us together, Jane.
That's true. That's true. But apologies, you were saying about the brain on poverty and the brain on trauma. They're essentially very similar.
It's yes. And so, and then because of that fascination with the science, I accidentally stepped into the science of resilience. And that science told us that our birth to 5 brain science was very incomplete, that the brain is malleable, it has plasticity well into, you know, adulthood and actually throughout its lifetime, right? And that the biggest thing people needed to heal brains was access to safe, supportive, available adult relationships. So I found my story in the science. And, you know, ACEs, then I found this way with ACEs. I have 8 ACEs. My mom has 9. But when you look
the
at
original 10 from the 1980 study, right?
Yeah, Jane. And so for me, there was a lot of freedom in that. I had already done quite a bit of healing work. And all of a sudden there was this new way to just say, I have 8 ACEs. And people were like, oh.
Yeah.
I didn't have to explain anymore, right?
Yeah.
But I became really fascinated with the science of resilience and what does this mean? Because that's really where our hope lies. And it's still, there's a lot of debate still around resilience, Jane, because people are using it as a label. And they're using it as this idea of, you know, this kid's so resilient, this kid. And resilience to me is really a verb.
Right. What do you mean by that?
So it's actionable, meaning that most of our resilience, especially in our early years, is built externally. It's not something we're born with.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
And, you know, for us, when I kind of figured, how do I get this into the brains of teachers so that they can absorb it and understand it quickly? You know, it really means I see you, I hear you, I'm with you. And how do we build schools and families and communities where that's kind of our driving force? And so that's kind of been the work that we've been on for the last few years of really helping people understand, if you want to increase achievement, stop focusing on achievement, start focusing on relationships, right? Which is a story of trauma informed. It really is. When people have access to power, to others, to resources, to ideas, to contribution. That's what builds our brains. And so
it's so interesting because I hadn't I mean, I possibly knew that you may have had some trauma and adversity in your story from interactions on Twitter, but I wasn't quite sure of the extent of it. And was there at any point when you were learning about the ACEs and trauma and the neuroscience and the 0 to 5s that this was a hopeless case, or did you find it more liberating that, you know, in a sense, your story was not that unique, in the sense that, you know, these things have a cumulative effect on any of us, and okay, they might manifest a bit differently in each person, and depending on their internal or external resources that they have and the relationships around them, that they might have fewer adverse adult outcomes than others. But from my experience with other people is, by and large, it's quite a light bulb moment to be presented with the ACEs science in particular. Did you find it kind of, you mentioned that it was freeing?
yeah, and you know, I was already on this rapid transformation journey. And so for me, there was just so much hope. And I also was spending a lot of time really helping the middle class understand poverty.
Okay.
And so there was a tool all of a sudden that I had in front of me, that we weren't talking value systems anymore. We were talking science.
Yes.
And because sometimes people get these stories, we all build stories in our heads, especially about people that we don't spend time with, right? Mm-hmm. So there was a whole new way to present the experience of poverty and toxic stress, and, you know, helping people understand that the anatomy of trauma is powerlessness and overwhelm, mm-hmm. right? That's what activates our fight or flight response system. You feel powerless, you feel overwhelmed, your brain kicks in, mm-hmm. things start happening. And that's good. That's what mm-hmm. needs to happen. And there's no human life that is, that hasn't experienced powerlessness and overwhelm. But helping people to understand that the components of toxic stress are powerlessness, overwhelm, and isolation.
Yeah.
And that is poverty every day of the week. Every day in poverty, you are full of powerlessness, overwhelm, and isolation. And so understanding that the easiest place to begin to work from is to buffer, counter the isolation, right? So there were just so many things, but I have used, I've used the ACEs indicator with thousands of teachers and hundreds of families. Jane, what do you think the first question is when I run it with families in my poverty project? So lots of moms and dads and grandparents caring for kids. When I say, hey, here's the science. Do you want to know your ACE score? And then they take it. What do you think the first question that comes up every time is?
I'm guessing, I could be wrong, but why am I only hearing this now?
Jane, thanks. And the question that I started to hear over and over again was, oh my gosh, what about my kids?
Oh, okay.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so for parents, it wasn't even about all the stuff that they had been through. It was really about, what about my kids?
Yes, because they could feel the transmission, or were already afraid.
Yeah.
And they could see, they probably knew that some of these things had already happened maybe as well.
Yeah, Jane, absolutely. And helping parents to understand that ACEs are not destiny, right? Mm-hmm. Like, and that, you know, and I've walked alongside of so many parents that have extreme trust issues, mm-hmm. anxiety, depression, and saying, okay, I get it. But if we know access to safe, supportive, available adults is a big part of building your kids' resilience, you're not in this by yourself, right?
Yeah.
How will you find those safe, supportive, available adults to build the village for your kid? And that's really where we start working from. You know, I have a lot of opinions about how we got where we are, but kids are much more isolated currently,
Yeah.
pre-COVID, than they were 10 years before, than they were 20 years before. And I think that's why a lot of the social emotional stuff, I don't know what's happening in the UK, but I think that's why a lot of the social emotional kind of behavior stuff that we have rampant in America is happening in our schools, because kids are coming to school to try and get those relational needs met that used to be met in the community, in the neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
So
it's a really interesting point, because I think it's on the rise here in Ireland as well, you know, anxiety and acting out, and even depression among young people. But part of it is the stressors of modern life, you know. So while poverty is massive, not everyone is poor, but I think a lot of people are highly stressed. And the adult relationships, like you mentioned, we're not always there for one another. We're in this flurry of action and reaction and worrying about status and whatever else we're worrying about. But for sure, I've had kind of unstable work for a while, and it's extremely stressful, you know, in and of itself. So poverty on top of all of these other adversities, and maybe on the community component, you might be able to help me out a bit in understanding. I think a lot of poor, particularly urban areas in Ireland, and I'm sure the States and elsewhere, you know, there's a kind of collective shutdown sometimes, you know, because there might be community violence, there's poor housing, there's all sorts going on, drug dealing, drug sale, you might be using yourself, just chronic stress, food insecurity, racism. How much can any one person withstand, and how much can any community withstand? So I guess your poverty project then seeks to build the relationships essentially to start. Would that be correct, Rebecca?
yeah, so families come in and we usually recruit a cohort of 10 to 20. And then we do a meal, and then the kids go to childcare and the adults go to class. And we do a 20-week course called Getting Ahead in a Just Getting By World. And it talks about economic class and the hidden rules of class, different ways that we show up to situations. And it's all done in a very kind of, this is what it is, what do you guys think about this manner? Instead of telling people how it is. So it's highly conversational, and you just see all these light bulbs go off for people. And then after the 20 weeks, they graduate, and then we match them with middle class friends. And while the parents were in the class, we're kind of training the middle class up on, hey, here's the idea of what poverty is and what it isn't, and preparing them to be in a friendship. And so, but our families are called leaders.
Okay.
They're called core leaders, and because they're the leader of their circle, their match circle, they're the leader of their own lives, and they're leaders in their communities.
Nice.
And we look at our families as experts on poverty. And, you know, we talk about, when you have a complex issue, what do you do to solve it? Well, you hire an expert.
Yeah.
And poverty is very complex, and people that have read about it, people that have studied it, they're not the experts on poverty in our community. It's the people that are experiencing it. Just like racism.
Yes.
It's the people that are experiencing it that are the ones that are going to light our path forward. And it's really important to show up and share power like that. You know, for me as a single mom, that was, you know, when I bumped up against the poverty project, I lived in a trailer house that should have been condemned. Like, little kids should not have been living there. So I was extremely afraid. And the first night they were like, hey, we see families struggling in our community, and we think the root cause of that is poverty, and we want to solve it. And we need people like you who are living it to tell us what to do. So Jane, instantly they disarmed me and they empowered me, right?
Yeah.
And for the very first time in my existence of 37 years, people were actually saying, hey, what do you think you need?
Right.
What do you think's going on? You would, you know, especially if you work in systems and policy, Jane, you'd just be, for somebody that has had to consume systems and nobody ever asks you
I
what
know.
you
I was,
need,
yeah.
right?
Which
There's
is
always these
shocking
outcomes.
that we don't. How many times can you think about prior to that? Had you ever been asked, what do you need, Rebecca?
Never.
Shocking and not
It's
surprising at the same time.
right. And, you know, so I've worked with so many families since, and I tell parents, I'm like, I have no idea how you're going to get out of poverty, but I believe you do. Once we set the conditions and create the right environment, you're going to find your path forward. And that's a really scary place to be, but it's really an important place to be, because you're giving people their own power back. And, you know, I live in a very, we have the haves and the have-nots kind of community, strong middle class. So everybody that's poor knows they're poor.
Right.
You
Okay.
know, you go to some communities, Jane, and the kids, you ask the kids, you know, about poverty. The kids are like, we're poor. They don't know because everybody is experiencing that. Right.
Yeah.
But growing up here in my town, you know, and so, you know, just to be brought into this space where the haves were like, hey, we see you guys now and we want to know how to help and what to do. There was just this incredible, I don't know, it was earth-shattering. It really was.
Did
And
the
so,
kind of, sorry,
go ahead.
pardon me, did the curtain of, well, I don't know if you maybe felt shame at being poor, but you know, sometimes the middle classes don't look at poor people with great empathy or interest or anything like it. So I'm just wondering, when treated with compassion and interest and curiosity and a desire to assist, but knowing that you weren't a savior either, did that help shift something in you, do you think?
Yeah, Jane, that original curriculum, there was a night in there where we talk about the causes of poverty. And it was the first time in my entire life that I had this idea that maybe this wasn't my fault. Maybe I wasn't a defective person. Maybe it's because I was born into poverty that all this stuff was going on. And that's kind of the same thing with the ACEs too. It's like, okay, no wonder I got addicted to drugs. No wonder I ended up in domestic violence. No wonder, right? Like, and so there's a lot of freedom in that. And changing those stories, right, about each other. And I had tons of stories about the middle class too, like lots of judgments, lots of ideas. And you bring these people together and you start spending time together and you become curious. And all of a sudden there's this moment that gets replicated over and over again where it's like, you're not anything like I thought you were. And that is powerful, right? And then when people leave those interactions, they go out and influence other people, right? And say, no, that's not what's going on. You think that's what's going on, but that's not really what's happening. And I think that it's slow and it's messy, and it's kind of the same way with trauma-informed work. We have to start spending time together and asking questions and listening and supporting.
Yes, I agree. And how do you recruit the middle class people? I presume you advertise somehow, and are they a mix of genders, or do they tend to be more female participants, and kind of what age range?
Yeah, they do. And they tend to be retired. Like if you had to kind of do a demographic, they tend to be retired. empty nesters kind of, a lot of couples. And in Midwest America, in the Bible Belt, we just have a lot of, I mean, a lot of the towns that we work with are 1,500 people, 2,000 people, 3,000 people in the whole town. So they're
Right.
tiny little towns. And so it typically really is out of the churches and the schools.
Okay.
When you get into rural areas, there aren't a lot of resources in your town. You know, to get services, people have to drive an hour to 2 hours away. So it really is churches, schools, city and county government. So, yeah.
And so in terms of the wider issues then, I mean, obviously, this is something outside of your own control or sphere of influence, but how important do you think it is that, you know, the state governments and the local cities and mayors, and then your soon to be new president and that administration will try and tackle inequity and poverty and racism, these things that cause such hardship and pain in people's lives?
You know, Jane, well, I can tell you an example. We had a governor, oh gosh, he was governor for like 6 or 7 years in Kansas, and he decided to cut, well, he didn't really cut the cash assistance to moms. In Kansas, if you had a baby, you could get cash assistance of $300 or $400 a month for a year. And it was called TANF money, TANF.
Okay.
And he moved a ton of the TANF money over to like some programs that would help kids in poverty once they left high school.
Okay.
So he moved a ton of the money. And what we saw, because there's this idea that if they don't have it, they'll figure something else out to do and they'll pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? And they'll go out and whatever. What happened is we went from, oh my goodness, I think we went from like 3,500 kids in the foster care system to 7,500.
Wow.
Almost overnight. And when I say overnight, it was about 2 years. But you think about how much that costs.
Yes.
I mean, financially, yes, but then to societies and to school systems and to family stories, and holy smoke. So I do think systemically there are some approaches. We're so stinking divided in the United States that we can get anything done. But I also think that at a local level, you know, one of the ideas is that there's this idea that, well, the government takes care of that.
Yes.
It's not our responsibility. And that's, you know, I always tell people, I'm like, we don't need a hill to save us. We don't need a state capital. We don't need a federal capital to come here and heal what's happening in our towns.
Right.
We do that. And that is always done through relationship, right? And so so many decisions too get made for teachers by people who've never been in a school except as kids when they went to school, right? So many people make decisions about poverty that don't know anybody that's poor. And so, you know, I always am a little shy about, oh man. And we have something called a welfare trap in America. I don't know if you guys have that in Ireland or not, Jane, but yeah. So, you know, mom's trying to make her way up in the world and she gets a $2 an hour raise and loses more in benefits. And so she has to go to the employer and say, I can't take the raise or quit her job. I mean, you get to a cliff. And so we work with families, and a lot of times, like, we're telling them, like, hey, there's this cliff. Let's just have you get right up to the edge of it and build a plan so you can jump it and get to the other side. I mean, we're really working to bring people to, so most of the families that come in make $12,000 to $13,000 to $15,000 a year.
Wow. Okay.
So it's really survival, right? And, you know, rent in our area costs anywhere from $600 to $1,000 a month. So when you're making $12,000 a year, right,
Yeah.
like you're always just chasing your tail. And so what we work to do is bring families to 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, $80,000 a year incomes in the 2 to 5 year process. Like that's where you're going. And
That's
so, and we've done
amazing.
it with lots and lots and lots of families. I've got to be a part of, over the last 8 years, I've got to be a part of walking with 96 adults that have made it out. And so collectively, it's, you know, close to $3 million of earned income a year increase that these families are making. And what that looks like, Jane, is it looks like degrees completed, careers, home ownership, vacation, you know, marriages, kids on traveling sports teams, investments. Like those are all the things that we see.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
so, you know, and I always tell families too, I'm like, I have no idea if money will make you happy, but money will give you power.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly one less stressor, you know, if you're just going to talk about the accumulation of toxic stress in our lives, then, you know, to have, and also the feeling of agency and choice and power, and that you don't just have to, you know, survive, that there is something beyond that, and that it, you know, it might take getting used to.
Yeah. And Jane, I tell families, I'm like, you know, this is not going to solve all your problems. You're just going to get new problems. Like you're going to get middle class problems, right?
Yeah.
But here's the example. And I don't know what happens in Ireland, but here we have a very, very traumatizing child welfare system. And, you know, we are snatching kids from families. And an example that I give is, you know, in 2011 or before, if child welfare would have showed up at my door with whatever allegation or whatever questions, there'd have been nothing I could do.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if that happened, I would call my attorney.
Yes.
Right. So very different power structures. You know, families in poverty live with this daily fear of somebody taking their children. Middle class people don't even have that thought.
No.
Right? Like, what do you mean?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, this happens on a regular basis. And, you know, our child welfare system kind of has this attitude of better safe than sorry. And you know, when I looked at one of the questions that you kind of asked me was, what areas of public policy in your state or country do you believe are most in need of change? And it is child welfare.
Right. And how would you like to see it shift? Is it so that we have more family supports and more of a strengths-based kind of, again, what do you need to be positioned to be the best parent that you can be? I mean, I don't know that any child welfare system really does that well. You know, what can we do for you to help you be the best parent that you can be? Because I know of some people who were in the care system, and it wasn't a good experience for them. You know, they wanted to still be at home, even if that was a difficult environment. And their parents did love them. Most parents love their kids, even if they don't know how to show it or be nurturing. So in what sense do you think the child welfare system needs to change in the States?
You know, Jane, I think that there's two things when I've really thought about going all the way to the root. One, if we made it basically illegal to take kids for poverty.
Okay.
And two, if we did not take kids for drug use.
Okay.
Now, with drug use and poverty, we're going to need some wraparound services and support. And, you know, you can't just keep shooting up heroin with your little kid, but you're obviously addicted. You obviously have this trauma, right? Because right now we just pull the kid, we wrap around the kid and we tell mom, get your shit together and come over here and meet all of these hoops you got to jump while you've just had your child ripped away from you because you are obviously at the lowest point of your life. And so how do we invest differently around our families? And we have examples of counties that have done this in the United States, and the return on investment is huge. And the biggest thing they had to work from was shifting the mindsets of the people that go in and make the reports, right? Right now it's a gotcha game. We walk in and we're looking for reasons to take your kid, instead of preparing people to go into homes and look for people to help.
Right.
Big mindset difference. So, understanding that right there, I think would do incredible things to use our public dollars very differently. And then the other thing is that we need to stop the war on drugs in America.
Yeah.
We have mass incarceration here, and it is now generational. And if we stopped the war on drugs, and started to invest in people, but, and I am not saying that we don't need to protect children, but so much of what kids are getting taken out of the home for is poverty and addiction, and not abuse and neglect. Because just because you don't have water on for a week, or you don't have, the ability to wash clothes, you're going to a neighbor's to do that, that does not necessarily mean neglect. It means poverty. But somehow we've got that all wrapped up together. And when you look at the dollars, it's like, wouldn't it just make more sense to turn that family's lights on than to take this kid out of there, right? And stick him into a system with strangers. And so, those are big places we could start working from.
Yeah, they certainly are. And do you think that in terms of training, that people working in child protection need to understand ACEs and trauma? And I asked Wendy Ellis, who came up with the pair of ACEs graphic and that brilliant building community resilience kind of framework, was she in favor of screening for ACEs? Because it's one of those very controversial issues, and she was very much of the view absolutely not, because while obviously she believes in the science of it and the epidemiology and all of that, she was saying Black and brown people would be disproportionately affected in the child protection and child welfare arena, and there'd be all these seizures because, again, of the intersection between poverty and racism and the war on drugs and all of that. Would you similarly have concerns, Rebecca, if screening were to become mainstreamed, in say in pediatrician clinics and child protection and that type of thing, or does it depend?
We have a very violent system. It's violent and it's cruel. And we have turned teachers against families. We have turned police forces against communities. And so again, I think there are some real healing and introspective self-awareness things that systems have to do. And, Jane, we would like to have humanity drive those conversations, but what typically drives those conversations for people is money. And that's okay, because when you look at these two systems, typically it is the citizens who are paying for these very invisible, silent, violent, and cruel systems to run. And so I have no idea why we would need to be using screeners with families or kids. For me, the ACE indicator is really about my own story. And putting the science in front of people and saying, hey, here's the screener. Do you want to know your score? The other place that I've seen it be really helpful, Jane, is in high schools, where they do it anonymously through a a computer generated survey, because so oftentimes people think we don't have that here.
Right,
And then
right,
they
yeah.
do a survey and you get this data and everybody's just kind of reeling for a minute. Right. So to test the population health as a whole,
Mm-hmm.
such as a high school or a neighborhood or whatever. But no, I do not think that we need to be using it as a tool on individual families to gird a case as to why we think that they need services, don't need services, should have their kids, shouldn't have their kids, like, and is more evidence of a hammer and a gotcha game. And I don't know if people would be truthful in those moments anyways, right? If the stakes are so high.
Sure.
So, you know, the way Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris did her work, and the Youth Wellness Center, I think we still have a lot to learn there. But when you read her book, The Deepest Well, she was so life-giving to parents. She was a pediatrician and she saw a lot of stuff. And she said, yes, there were a handful of times that things were bad and I had to make calls. But that was not the story. The storyline was, I'm here to help people, help them understand the science, and help them understand the services that we're finding might be helpful for their kids, which parents are invested in that, right? And they need access. And so, you know, the way she used it was more as okay, this kid has this many and they're presenting behaviors attached to that. Let's get some services, right? So yeah, I don't know. There would have to be a lot of transformation in our world and in our systems, Jane. I think, Jane, in 50 to 100 years, I think we'll look back on some of the stuff we're doing now and think, those barbarians.
Yeah, probably.
Like,
probably.
How did they do that? Why did they do that? Right? Like, there will be a tipping point that'll get us out of this, but I don't know if we're quite there yet.
Well, I think a very fair point, because for sometimes I think, well, you know, it's not right to ignore the prevalence of this either. And, you know, if we don't ask, if we don't inquire, if we're not curious, we're missing so much as well. So I go round and around, but I do think where there's power, it's apt to be abused. And again, when you're talking child protection wise, systems are risk averse. They get raked through the media when bad things happen. You know, so it's very challenging from that point of view. But also, I suppose, one of the things that kept popping through my mind as you were talking, and even around addiction and exiting it and the war on drugs, is Johann Hari has a nice phrase at the end of his book about the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And just going back to your own story and meeting those middle-class people and feeling your brain changing, can you tell me a little bit more about that? And was it feeling kind of seen and heard, and that you mattered, and those type of things? Was that what led to some of the neural pathways changing, do you think? Or is it even, can you even explain it?
Yeah, Jane, that's a really good question. So being on the outside and looking in for most of my life, and feeling like I didn't have a purpose, and carrying a ton of shame, and spending a lot of time in this part of my brain, right? Like, this part of my brain was like super wired.
Yeah.
And so being in this space with people that were talking about ideas and possibilities, and they were curious about me, and what do you think about that? Oh, why do you think that? Oh, tell me more, right? They were genuinely concerned and curious about me and my kids before we ever got there. And they were like, hey, let's end poverty in our town. Come be a part of that. You're the expert. We need you at the table. So all these things started happening at once, but it really was this reciprocal experience. And a lot of it was finally being seen, Jane, and being included.
Sure.
So that I see you, I hear you, I'm with you, right? Like that is the phrase I coined around resilience, because that's the deal. And then also, Jane, realizing that I was also a part of their middle class healing.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Their guilt and shame, maybe.
Yes. And their, just the expense that they have endured for their lifetime of the masks that they've had to wear.
Right.
And coming into community with a bunch of poor people, and everybody starts to transform, right? So there's, I would imagine there's a ton of oxytocin and all these chemicals happening, and, you know, our brains are lighting up like, but, you know, as I got into these women's lives, and I started to get to kind of look behind the curtain of a place I'd never been able to go, and they were able to do the same thing, and realize, wow, there's addiction in their backgrounds, there's abuse in their families, there's money problems, there's marital problems, there's, right? And just kind of understanding that, and then finding a place where I get to go here every Thursday night and I can be who I really am. And if I fell from a station tomorrow of whatever career identity I have, nobody in this room would care. They would still want me here. So there was these great attributes that we just got to start sharing. And it's so funny, Jane, because I was working with a group of high school kids one time, and there was a couple kids in the group that were actually living in a camper with no power. And then there were some really upper middle class kids in the group, and everything in between, right? And we were talking about economic class and going through these conversations. And I asked him, I said, okay, and we got several weeks in, right? And I asked him, I said, okay, do poor people love their children? And the kids are like, yes, poor people love their kids. And I'm like, okay, do middle class people love their kids? Yes, middle class people love their kids. And I'm like, okay, do wealthy people love their kids? And the kids are like, no, wealthy people don't love their kids. And then the principal pops up and he's like, and he goes, yeah, no. And I said, well, why do you think they don't love their kids? And he says, well, they have to send them to boarding schools and they have to do all this stuff. And I looked at every single person in that room and I said, do you actually know any wealthy people? And they were like, well, no. I'm like, then how do you know they don't love their kids? Right? This is an example of the stories that we tell about each other.
Yeah. The prejudices, yeah, the narratives.
Yes, Jane, one of the worst stories that we can ever tell about another population of people is that they don't care about their kids.
So true.
And it's not true, right? Like it's
yeah.
Their kids, right? Yeah. But we say that this country over here, this like they don't care about their kids. Like that's like the worst character assignment you can give a group or a person. And it's just, you know, I've told teachers this when I work with them. I'm like, I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of at-risk parents, and I don't care how screwed up they were. I don't care what they had going on. I've never met a parent that didn't love their kids. And I've told parents, I've worked with thousands of teachers, and I don't care how stressed out they are, how burnout they are. I've never met a teacher that doesn't want every kid to be successful. Those are the fundamental truths we have to work from to build this other reality, right? And so, and child welfare, you know, they're not the bad guys either, right? School systems aren't the bad guys. And I think, Jane, that's probably, you know, the thing that was really kind of like this reconciliation of humanity for me was when I really had to accept this truth with the neuroscience and the epidemiology. There are no bad guys.
Yeah.
There are no us and them. It's just us. And that in and of itself is kind of that space where you're like, okay, if that's true, then what does that mean?
Yeah, indeed. I think that's what's wonderful about your community work and bringing, you know, a warm, buffering group around someone who's lacked it in the past. And it's so true for you. You mightn't be able to do anything overnight about the actual grinding poverty, but the relational poverty, Bruce Perry talks about that all the time. And as you mentioned, it's that absence that really can be the killer for people. And if you can provide it, therein lies the healing and the potential and even the ability to see oneself differently. Can I ask you, just because of the work that you do in schools and the fact that you're clearly brilliant and talk about meaning and purpose now in your life, but as a young person, as a child and a teenager, how was school for you?
Jane, thanks for asking that question. Grade school was amazing. I had incredible teachers that had me convinced that I was wanted and loved and smart and important. Then middle school came, which in our area is sixth grade, which, you know, sixth grade is this whole other disease for human beings, right? But I went to this building where all of a sudden, you know, the first day I stepped out of the car, it just kind of washed over me all in one moment that I was poor. I never like, oh, and I'm not poor. I'm like really flipping poor. And I knew in that moment, I didn't want kids to know. I didn't want teachers to know. And I lost that warm, connected feeling of grade school teachers. And so within a couple of months, Jane, I was lighting that building on fire. I was that kid,
right?
You know, got a pretty permanent seat in the vice principal's office and made every teacher nuts. And what I couldn't say, but what I was screaming was, I'm ashamed, I'm scared, I'm lonely, and I need you, right? And then by high school, I was becoming, you know, masterful at creating chaos. And so I dropped out of high school on my 16th birthday. You know, I've been out running the truancy officer for quite a while. I moved out when I was 15 and rented a trailer house in that same small hidden ghetto that I ended up in when I was 37 years old. So, and then at 16 years old on my 16th birthday, I left state and with my soon to be husband, and he was fresh out of the penitentiary. And I didn't call or come home for 3.5 years, right? I went to major cities and just kind of city hopped and very quickly found far worse than what I came from. And ended up in that marriage for 13 years, caught up in a very vicious cycle of domestic violence. And, you know, my husband became a professional drug dealer. So in our community, wherever we were, he had ultimate power.
Right.
And I made it out of that marriage with my life and nothing.
Right.
And so definitely, you know, understand that whole, and then became a raging alcoholic. Jane, the last 4 years of my drinking, I drank a half gallon of 100 proof vodka every day. So,
and it was never enough probably either, you know, to actually get the pain away and stuff.
I was physically addicted to alcohol. So if I stopped drinking, I would go to the hospital, right? And start to have delirium tremens and seizures and that whole kind of deal. So, and now I look at all of that. Like there was somebody on Twitter one time that said that they don't think that there's anybody that is grateful for the trauma that they experienced. And I kind of piped up and I said, I'm really grateful for all of it.
Okay, wow.
And they were like, what do you mean by that? And I said, because it gives me automatic entrance into people's lives and I can help them.
Well, massive authenticity for sure, and hope, because you're living, breathing, fabulous example of what can be, you know, that there's nothing like that. So I can understand what you mean. You wouldn't be so reachable, I guess. And when you then go and do your work with schools, are schools typically receptive to information about trauma and adversity and neurobiology and resilience?
Yeah, so Jane, I use the way that I train schools is all through storytelling.
Okay, super.
And through interactive activities. And when I first go into schools, I see the teachers first, and I start to talk about vicarious trauma and co-care. Teachers don't want to hear the conversation of self-care.
Right.
It's almost shaming to say, hey, this is really tough. We know what you guys are going through. You need to do these self-care activities so that you can endure this special kind of whatever torture that happens on the daily with kids. And they love kids, they love the profession, but I see them first. And we start to really, primarily that's where we work from, is how are you going to build a culture of co-care and connection in your building with adults before you ever start thinking about jumping to the kids. But teachers are watching this, these kids come in younger and younger that are violent, kids that are not prepared for learning, kids that are disengaged as teenagers. They're seeing it, and teachers, they want to help kids. And so they're pretty interested in, what does this mean? Explain our current reality to us, and then help us to figure out how we build a path forward. So Jane, I work for a whole year with the school. So 3 full days over the course of a year. And then we test for buy-in. Because teachers they have initiative fatigue.
Sure.
Every new leader comes in, we get a new initiative, and the older teachers will start to tell the younger teachers, honey, just keep your head down because this too, right? Like, so how do we build a culture, right? Because it's not a program.
No, it's a way of being.
It's a way of being. And, then it radiates out. And the last place we end up is policy, because to change policies in schools, you're going to have to get the parents on board, the school board on board, right? But let's work within this kind of ecosystem here first. And it takes schools 3 to 5 years to transform, to be truly trauma informed. It's slow and it's messy, and it's got lots and lots of tripwires along the way, right? But yes, Jane, I have built, I should say I have got to be a part of building, because the schools really do it, and my team helps too. Gosh, I don't know, between 50 and 70 trauma-informed buildings in the last, 3 to 4 years.
It's very impressive. And is that throughout Kansas?
Yeah, and I've got to work with a couple, I've gone out of state, and I've also got to work with some remote schools out of state, but yeah, Maryland and Wisconsin, and so other states too. But yeah, Ohio. Yeah, some good things up there.
Well, what's interesting in how you say about working with the teachers first, of course, that makes sense, because it's like working with the parents to benefit the child. It's like you work with those who are in a caregiving role first, and then when the adults change, the children will benefit from that. But is there anything that you would like to see in terms of decision making, whether it's to do with funding for schools, or, making training around trauma more of a priority? Because as you rightly mentioned, this could just be another fad. It's something that I hear sometimes, in the criminal justice setting, is trauma. Oh yeah, it's just a buzzword now, it'll be gone in a while and something new will come in. Do you think that is the case? Do you think trauma-informed care and trauma-informed education will be a fad, or do you think it is here to stay?
No, I believe that it is becoming our new theory of everything.
I like that.
So it will permeate into all of our systems, into our home life. And the reason that it's so, besides just this irrefutable evidence, right, that just continues to come, trauma and the story of trauma and our biology and our brain and our behavior is really personal to people.
Mm-hmm.
So it isn't about some theory or some system. It's about my spouse's childhood. It's about my best friend's marriage. It's about my MS. It's
Mm-hmm.
about, and so no, Jane, I do not believe that it's going to go away. I think it will only continue to deepen and just become more and more of a part of who we are, which is really hopeful. Gosh, there was something else that you said that was
Oh,
really...
I segued. I do that often where I distract myself and ask another question. But just in terms of education policy, Jill Biden is a teacher and she plans to work in the White House. Would you be hopeful that she might have a different type of influence maybe on valuing teachers and their safety and their, you know, having schools safe places, you know, prioritizing that for all children and all staff?
You know, Jane, that's a really good question. Again, you have incredible questions. I love your curiosity. And so, gosh, several things come up. Here's the deal. Our school systems in America were not designed to do what we're asking teachers to do now, which is to build this emotional intelligence, deal and mitigate trauma and the explosiveness of trauma or suicide or depression. You know, the load that we're putting on teachers is they're buckling under the weight of that. So first and foremost, we need to see our staff. But I also think that we need to recognize that our institution of academia and workforce readiness, that our society is asking us to do something different. And I don't think it's either or. I think we need to recognize that this responsive behavior and toxic stress and all the things our kids are crying out for, we're just in a different place now. Mm-hmm. So how do we bring mental health services, group, therapy, right? How do we create resources on campus? Mm-hmm. Especially in your rural communities, because like I said before, oftentimes it's the school and it's the church,
right?
Or the 10 churches, right? Those are, so really the public building is the school. Families have to drive hours to get mental health services. And I think with COVID, we're going to start opening some things up. But so to answer your question, Jane, how do we start to have healthcare and mental health and therapeutic, it doesn't even have to be therapy, but therapeutic experiences on our campuses? And I also think doing some really important kind of group therapy, conflict management, decompression kind of things for our staff on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Is part of co-care.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not talking outside of their workday.
Yeah, as part of it.
As part of, so I do think that systemically we can open up some really important, and then, you know, the question becomes, how do we find enough providers for our remote area? But that's a way better kind of problem to begin solving than we can't get services out there, right? Like, so yeah.
Indeed. One very last question. I think you say that those closest to the pain need to be closest to the power and the solutions. So in that regard, do you think just in this context now of the teachers and in education, do people making policy around schools and education needs to listen more to teachers and I guess their students and also parents, but teachers who are maybe finding it hard to withstand all these multiple demands in an ever-changing environment.
Jane, that's really good. We're doing some big school improvement in Kansas called redesign, and but it's really interesting because they would go in and do these kind of like listening little tours inside of their schools, and they go get all the kids and ask them questions whose school was working really well for them. Mm-hmm. Like, what would you change, right? I'm like, we need to find the kids that are about to drop out. Mm-hmm. We need to find the teachers who are about done.
Right.
But still, teachers in general at the policy building table, and teachers that are still in the trenches, right? Because I remember how poverty felt, but I've been out of poverty since 2014, so 6 years. I remember, but it's not the same as being in it, right? And so having access to people that are in it, that can tell us, right? And then you have to understand that we're a complex mixed bag of human beings, and that our communities have cultures, we have DNAs. And so, but we have, we're trying to figure out how to get to Mars. I'm pretty sure we can handle complex issues.
Yeah.
So how do you take all these dynamics and start to really create a path forward? So that's, yes.
Rebecca Lewis-Pankratz, you've been amazing. I've really learned so much, and the phenomenal work you're doing there. It's really inspirational, and I'm going to certainly draw on what you're doing and say we need all of this here and more besides. It's really impressive stuff, and I imagine you wake up every day, or hopefully you do, full of purpose and energized for the fight that will follow, because it's not always easy, for sure, to keep the momentum up, but it is really worth doing. And so thank you for talking to me on how to talk policy and influence people. It's been a pleasure, a real pleasure.
Jane, thank you.
And all the best now going forward.